Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first Max Weber lecture of this academic year. This is also the first Max Weber lecture that we're going to have since the pandemic started, so we're especially delighted to be able to continue with the tradition of Max Weber lectures here as part of the Max Weber program for postdoctoral studies. We will have further Max Weber lectures during this year. The schedule for the spring is not complete yet, but will be hopefully quite soon. Today we're very happy to have Carles Boix from Princeton University, who will be introduced by Veronica Angel, one of our Max Weber fellows. But before I leave the floor to them, I would like to remind everyone in this room to have your masks on when you're not speaking, and also remind that the talk and the following interview with Professor Boix and two Max Weber fellows will be recorded and available on the Max Weber
Recording
program
in
YouTube
progress.
channel. Now you know that you're being recorded. Okay. I'll leave the floor to Veronica, who will invite today's speaker and tell more about his work. Please.
Thank you, Juho. And first of all, on behalf of all Max Weber Fellows, a huge thank you to the Max Weber team, who has chaired us through these trying times. A big thanks goes to Onion, to Yashvani, to Karen. We have made it out of the pandemic almost sane, so thank you for that. And of course, we owe a debt of gratitude to Juho and to Professor Miriam Golden for having organized this lecture for today. Now, my first point was introduce self, which I already messed up. So I'm Veronica Angel. I'm a Max Weber Fellow here and an adjunct professor of risk in international politics and economics at the Johns Hopkins University Europe. And it is my great honor to introduce Professor Carles Boix. Professor Carles Boix is the Robert Garrett Professor of Politics and Public Affairs at Princeton University since 2006. That was only 10 years after having defended his PhD at Harvard. And he is currently visiting the EUI while being the director of the ERC Advanced Senior Grant Project for the birth of party democracy. Now, among Professor Boix's many accolades, and beyond his over 15,000 Google Scholar citations, because yes, I Googled, I would like to mention the APSA William Riker Award and the Dimate Dogan Award for the best book, talking about democracy and redistribution, with which we are all more or less familiar. The book brought us the Boix unified theory, if we may call it that way, of political transition and regime survival based on a rational choice model that speaks to economists, to historians, to political scientists, a sample of which we have here today to challenge you with important questions. And the book seeks to answer major questions such as why is stable democracy achieved? Why do authoritarian regimes survive? Why do revolutions take place? And so on. These are important questions that we may not have the courage to address anymore the way some people have managed to do with such extraordinary achievement. Now, a key connection that Professor Boix has investigated throughout has been that between the role of inequality for democratic stability and democratic emergence. And his latest book, Democratic Capitalism at the Crossroads, has a focus on those important moments of technological change in challenging equilibria. Now, this speaks in so many ways on contemporary problems of the society. And Professor Boix will also deliver tomorrow a masterclass for those lucky few who got in. Now, one of my most demanding mentors, Professor Klaus Offe, with whom I had a conversation last week and I bragged about the possibility of meeting Professor Boix, told me, "Oh, excellent, his research is solid, original, and with a political point." I wrote that down immediately. That's the best you're ever going to get of Professor Offe. But that was a clear confirmation for me that we are going to be in for a treat, not only from a great researcher, but from an intellectual and a major mind. So I cannot imagine a more important topic to deal with right now than the proposed topic for today, the struggle for political emancipation and the formation of modern national identities. I hereby invite Professor Boix to have the floor for the next, well, now it's 15 minutes, until 6, and then we will ask you all those important questions that I promised you will challenge you with. So thank you very much for being with us.
Okay, so thank you, Veronica, for your very kind words. And thank you for inviting me to give this Max Weber lecture at the Institute. It's an honor to be here. Let me start by saying that, you know, this being a Max Weber lecture, I thought that the first thing I had to do was to investigate what Weber wrote about nations and nationalism. So I told myself that, you know, this investigation was kind of the toll or the price I had to pay for this invitation. And so I looked up, not directly, because it was, you know, in a hurry when this idea came to me. And, you know, when I started looking, I had the almost certainty that Max Weber had said something about this issue, because indeed he had something to say, for better or worse, about almost everything. So, you know, the cost was low if I didn't find something, and in fact I did. He had scattered writings in 1910 and 1912, where he seems to have said two things. One is that he rejected the notion that nation is based on practices such as language, religion, ethnicity, state membership, mostly because, true to himself, given his theoretical assumptions, what he thought fundamental, as you know, about social action is that what matters is the meaning that individuals attribute to those practices. So the practices themselves are not sufficient to explain nation. Then more positively, that's the second point, he said, or he understood nation as a community based on shared feelings of national belonging. And so notice here, this is slight tautology, which is a kind of Weberian tautology, and so probably, you know, should be forgiven. Not to students, but to Max Weber, we can do that. So as I said, the writings of Max Weber were very sort of scattered, very short, vague, and kind of inconcrete, but they seem enough to justify this lecture. So I will follow, you know, talking, to keep talking. And, you know, justify the underlying question that I have here, I would like to pose, which is if a nation is a community of shared feelings, or if you want a language that is not so normatively laden or loaded as a common self-understanding. So the question then is, where do these feelings come from, right? Let me say that I have not worked on this before, and given what I have done previously, it seems like a strange topic coming from me, but it's basically that I'm interested in political obligation. I'm interested in the question of why we obey and the state and you know, others. And so this comes from really a traumatic experience I had when I was in PhD program. I decided to take this class with Judith Shklar, who was a well-known theorist at Harvard. And so the class was packed. I had to sit on the floor. These were the times where people were not masked. And almost shouting, she would say, the only fundamental thing about politics is why we obey. And she scared me so much that I left. I didn't take the course. But since then, I have been always thinking about this as a fundamental question. That's how I came to this topic, right? So let me start now and basically go into this, which is basically the result, or is a paper. So in January of 1790, basically 6 months after the storming of the Bastille, the National Assembly in France decided to grant full citizenship to all the Jews of what they called Portuguese and Spanish origin. Basically traders and merchants that were living in Bayonne, in Bordeaux, and in Avignon. And then a year and a half later, after very heated debates, in September of 1791, they emancipated the rest of French Jews, including Alsatian Jews who lived in ghettos and were very hated by the Christian communities that lived with them. And to these revolutionaries supporting political emancipation, that was kind of a self-evident truth, right? So Clément Tonnerre, who was one of the most ardent defenders of emancipation, put it before the National Assembly and said, it is enough to be a man and to be a civilized man to enjoy the rights of the citizen. Accordingly, Jews should be citizens because they are men and they are French, and because you have decreed that every French man is a citizen. Now, even to Clément Tonnerre, though, this came with a non-negotiable condition, right? Something that could not be negotiated or bargained over, which was basically the idea that Jews had to dissolve themselves into the French nation and be there only as private individuals. So as a nation, he said, we can consider, and literally said, we can consider Jews as a nation or as individuals. And he added, as a nation, we should deny everything to Jews. Because if they present themselves as nations, he went on, if they told you, we have our civil laws to which we intend to subject ourselves, we have created powers which we intend to obey, and yet we ask to be part of your society, then we should, without any doubt, reject those absurd claims. But at the same time, he said, if they come as individuals, then we should give them everything, which means being French. Okay? So the full social and political integration of Jews took a long time to happen, to achieve, and it did resting on sort of fragile foundations. So think about the Dreyfus affair, the treatment of Jews under Pétain. So clearly, until the end of World War II, or after World War II, there was always a tension in French society, but it's still the involvement of Jewish individuals into French society and politics was undeniable. So for example, during the Third Republic, there were about 50 Jews who were ministers, deputies, senators. 6 of the ministers of police were Jews. And so they were fully integrated, or relatively well integrated, into the French Republic. And so Joseph Reynard, who was the secretary of Gambetta, a radical politician in France, wrote that Jewish statement worship the religion of the French Revolution in their hearts. Right? So Jews, both in France but also in the US, with the acquisition of at least formal rights, they identified with their nation. They were Jews in private life, but they were French and they were American, right? And this is something that also happened in other places. It happened as the Napoleonic troops moved throughout Europe. In some places, it stayed there, like the Netherlands. In some places, when they left, again, emancipation disappeared, but it came back in Italy with unification, in the United Kingdom in the way they do this, the British piecemeal legislation, one thing at a time. And then in the 60s in northern Germany, southern Germany, and even Austria-Hungary. Now, this path, this emancipatory path, was exceptional, right? Or at least it was not unique. In Eastern Europe, where most of Jews lived, 2/3 of them, at the end of the 19th century, discrimination was systematic. And here I give two examples. Romanians, or the Romanian constitution, limited the rights of citizenship to a few hundred Jews, although there were thousands of them. And in spite of continuous pressure from the Western powers that supported Romania and tried to, sort of get in exchange protection for the rights of Jewish individuals. Clearly, we know about Russia and the wave of pogroms that took place in the 1880s and then in the early 1900s, and the introduction of an extremely harsh discriminatory regime. So political emancipation in these places, to happen, it had to wait till World War I, the Russian Revolution. And so in those places, political integration of the kind I was referring to was impossible. So in 1896, Herzl, the father of Zionism, just wrote, "We have sincerely tried everywhere to merge with the national communities in which we live, seeking only to preserve the faith of our fathers," but then concluded, "This integration is impossible because in our native land, where we have lived for centuries, we are still decried as aliens. And this will probably remain for an indefinite period." So in places where the emancipation treatment, if you allow me to use this kind of language, didn't happen, the outcome could only be basically exit from the polity, right? And in three forms. One would be migration to liberal places. That's the story of Jews that leave for the USA, for New York and wherever, or South Africa under the protection of British in Cape Town or Argentina. The second one was socialism. So it's basically a second emancipation, right? So that's where Marx says, well, formal rights, what is that? You have material rights. So a lot of Jews attach themselves to this program because it is promising that emancipation will come. They will be able to be a citizen in a fully formed polity. And then the third possibility is the construction of a separate identity as a nation. The claim that they are a nation and that therefore they should have their own political institutions. That's, I think, the message of Moses Hess, writing in 1862, completely forgotten till pogroms come in Russia, writing from Vienna. He says, "We shall always remain strangers among nations. They may even be moved by a sense of humanity and justice to emancipate us, but they will never respect us so long as we make ubi bene ibi patria our guiding principle, indeed almost a religion, and place it above our own great national memories." So it's a call to liberate yourself, to emancipate yourself through the construction of a nation, given that this nation is not given to you by others. So let me pause here and try to justify why I think that studying Jewish national identity formation is beyond its intrinsic historical interest, which is clear, to me at least. Three reasons why we should study this. The first one is that, at least to me, the Jewish experience mirrors the full range of contemporary processes of national identity formation. It goes from unified nation states, France, where they incarnate themselves into the nation, to multinational states, places where you have, as Anderson would call it, an assembly of Ireland. And those two experiences, the same people experience all these things. So it's worth investigating why they go into these very different trajectories. The second is that empirically it is convenient. It is convenient because no matter how much you publish, your colleagues ask you, and especially young people, ask you for more. They want you to identify things. They do not believe you. They sort of harass you in tweets and things like that, right? So you need to find a way to reduce heterogeneity, to find things that have been treated differently, but they are as similar as possible if you want to still be alive today, intellectually, I mean. Although you don't need that in Florence, I suppose, in downtown. It's very nice. You don't need to publish. In Florence, in the institute you have to, okay? So the third thing is that it allows me to challenge a literature, what I call the canonical literature in national identity formation, that I think that is not right, or at least fully right. And so I'll go through these 3 points in reverse order. So let's start with the theory. So about 40 years now, Benedict Anderson was lamenting the fact that in contrast to the influence that nationalism had in the modern world, there was very, or he said, as he put it, plausible theory about it is conspicuously meager. That same year, several books appeared, and altogether, they had a big impact, and I think we still live from that. And they made 3 fundamental claims. They are, it's like a family, so there are many things, but altogether, when you think about them, I think that there are 3 claims. One is that nations are cultural constructs, that against primordialism, against this idea that nations are long-standing phenomena, that they have fixed characteristics. In fact, their claim was, and these are quotes from Gellner, they were contingent things. The second claim is basically that they are a modern cultural construct. Basically, Gellner is very clear about this, but Anderson, too, and others, in a pre-industrial world, there was basically a ruling class endowed with a unified culture, and then there was a mass of peasants. And these peasants lived in separate communities. They had these inward-turned lives. They were eating Parmigiano, I guess, and nothing else. They had dialects that made them incomprehensible to each other across territories, and they certainly lacked any national identity as we understand it today. And then the third claim is that modern nations were constructed by nationalist agents. So basically that once social and economic modernization dissolves the old world for whatever reason, through whatever mechanism, nationalist agents are enabled by that to engender nations, right? To impose on a community a certain conception of itself. In fact, when you read a bit more Max Weber, he sort of says this too. He says, national feeling is a real thing, but it's kind of inconcrete. As soon, he writes, as you get close to it, it evaporates. And so the intellectual, to Max Weber, who was a nationalist, he was the son of a national liberal politician, very proud of German unification. The intellectual had a fundamental role in forming, in shaping a national community, because a national community was a good thing. It meant that people had ways to adhere to norms, cooperate, and so on and so forth. So this, as I said, canonical literature was very influential, but I think it has a set of problems. And I want to focus on 2 authors quickly, Gellner and Anderson, to kind of discuss very quickly these sort of, I think, shortcomings in the literature. If you remember your Gellner, basically, to Gellner, nation is a byproduct of industrialization. With industrialization, the old agrarian system order breaks down. There is a new society coming in, a society of permanent growth, social mobility, and a place where the production system basically is different. It's not about manipulating things so much as manipulating meanings, and fundamentally it requires a standardized set of skills. Communication becomes central, language becomes central, and to be efficient, and clearly, Gellner is a very functionalist author, and so not of my liking, the state intervenes to set up an educational system, a high culture for everyone. And it's through that, in response to the needs of industrialization, that somehow the concept of nation emerges, right? So you have here agents that construct nations even when sometimes they didn't even know that they were doing this. Now, in Gellner, I think there are three problems, at a minimum. The first one is that empirically, industrialization played no crucial role in the emergence of national identities. When you look at the data, national identities, modern national identities, were born in agrarian societies. South America was an agrarian society, the US was an agrarian society, and France in the 1780s, no matter what many Marxist historians claim, was not an industrialized society. So it doesn't feel like the theory is right. The second one is that cultural and linguistic standardization were not essential to have growth, right? Nations had or nation states, if you will, very different sizes. There is no optimal size of a nation, at least in Gellner, perhaps in Alesina, but not in Gellner. And some nations have many languages, like Switzerland, which seems to be a relatively successful nation, I think. The third thing is that these theories rest on arguable behavioral assumptions, both in Gellner, in Hobsbawm, in Linz, because they basically do this kind of a strange thing that I don't like, and I hope you don't like either, which is that on the one hand, they treat elites as rational, as endowed with agency, but all the others, and I consider myself not an elite, as not having that agency, right? Pre-modern individuals in this literature are conceived as blank slates, where, elites can paint whatever they want. They are, to use Marx terms, and I use Marx because if we talk about Max Weber, we need someone to compensate, this. They are the simple addition of homonymous magnitudes, much as potatoes in a sack from a sack of potatoes, right? To the point that their interests form no community, no national bond. They are nothing, right? Now, this, I think, is important to the literature because if they are that, then governments can instill through mass education, through military conscription, through the standardization of linguistic and bureaucratic practices across the territory under their control, they can instill a national identity. So I grant that. But if that's the case, all states that try to do this should have succeeded in creating this national identity, and yet many didn't. We have lots of failed attempts at the construction of a unified nation state. So let me turn to Anderson. In Anderson, technological change is also crucial to the construction of a nation. Technology, in this beautiful but awkwardly written book, is about printing technologies. They allow people plus the secularization of cultures and the vernacularizaation of languages, printing technologies allow for the formation of a community, of an imagined community among a specific assemblage of fellow readers. They are all reading in the newspaper while they are drinking coffee in a port in in South America. And that, and since I read Anderson, that's the treatment that you receive from doing social science. Anytime I read a newspaper, I'm now thinking, who is reading this newspaper with me? So there must be something to it. But, again, I have problems with this. Why did they converge on a nation or not in any other type of community, such as class or race or soccer clubs, right? They could have constructed that, but they didn't. So to me, Anderson's theory only works in the Americas with a story of discrimination. For example, the fact that George Washington, who ordered his suits from a London tailor, got fed up with dealing with these shopkeepers in England. And of course, he was not allowed to get into the Imperial Army either. So that led to this discrimination and him jumping to something else. In Europe, Anderson stresses linguistic discontinuities, but this to me is again unconvincing, because France was, at the end of the 19th century, not a unified nation from a linguistic point of view. And Switzerland has been able to construct a multilingual society, but a politically unified society, not in the sense of the institutions to manage conflict, but as a sense of something, right, together, as a feeling of a national common identity. So, the forces of social and economic modernization were not sufficient, in my opinion, to trigger the construction of a national identity. National identity, to me, was endogenous to political foundational moments. And that's what I want to do next, with 2 slides on a bit of theory, and then I'll go into the Jewish case. So basically, to understand, not get ahead of myself, so to understand where this national identity comes from, I think that it's good to consider the social structures that preceded the French Revolution, basically the structures of ancien regime societies. And here I would like to use the words of a French historian, François Furet, who says that traditional societies were broken up into interest groups and founded on inequality, both as a social reality and as a collective mental representation. So very quickly, it's just an ideal type, which is apropos being a Max Weber lecture. These were societies where you had a conglomerate of corporate bodies with some states and guilds and cities and religious orders that had some jurisdictional autonomy. Internally, they were very stratified. They were characterized by unequal relations between nobles, servants, masters, apprentices, professors, PhDs, or researchers in the UI, high-low clergy, all these kinds of things. Externally, they were integrated in a hierarchy of power and influence. And fundamentally, the social bonds that tied them inside and outside were relations, but basically they were characterized by relations of domination and subordination, both materially and legally, but also in terms of mental representations. This was also, I think, important. So to that, the Enlightenment ideals and the liberal project, so to speak, came to offer an alternative blueprint, in which basically the old system had to disappear. And to Furet, in his discussion of a French Catholic author, Cochin, in interpreting the French Revolution, which is a beautiful book I recommend, traces this back to the emergence of what he calls philosophical societies. So basically, literary clubs and societies, and Masonic lodges and academies and all kinds of patriotic clubs that, starting in the 1750s, appear, and they are fundamentally defined by being a form of social life, Furek writes, based on the principle that its members, in order to participate in it, must divest themselves of all the concrete distinctions and of their real social existence. Very much as a Mason in the movies or whatever, does, right? If you want to think about this in these ways. This concept of an abstract society made up of equal individuals then transpose itself to the whole society in the Atlantic societies a bit later, right? And it involved four things, I think. First, the recognition of individuals as having equal standing. And again, we can discuss what this means. Could be formal, material. I'm sure that some of you are Bavarian, others are Marxist. I don't care. It's just about what is the meaning that people give to the promise of having equal standing that has an implication for the construction of a nation. They live then, or the promise was to live under a unified system of laws and a single common lawgiver. And this resulted in an overarching political identity. They were all together as equal with a lawgiver on top of them. And this led, in fact, I think it was the modern conception of nation. They accepted divesting themselves of their own identities in exchange for equal citizenship. Now, this happened at a time where two conditions took place. One is that the liberal project developed in places in a world where international boundaries were sort of stable or relatively stable. And ancien regime societies were heterogeneous internally, with some that wanted to destroy that and some that wanted to retain that situation, right? And very quickly, when the liberal blueprint succeeded, it led to a unified, to an unchallenged conception of national identity. But when it didn't, then a nation became highly, in a sort of a unified meaning to everyone, became highly unlikely. Because there was no commitment to build a nation as a community of equals. And that's where there are these several periphery nationalisms that aspire to recreate in their territory the abstract society of equals that they have been denied participation in. And this ties with, I think, the Jewish political experience. In some places they had that, in some places they didn't. Their responses were very different. At the beginning of the age of liberalism, Jews were spread throughout all Europe and the Americas, and of course the MENA region. Despite the geographical dispersion, they were pretty similar. They had similar cultural norms, societal institutions. They had a specific relationship with the sovereign. They were considered different and generally inferior to other groups, but even then, their political articulation was not that different from the concept of the conglomerate of corporations I was talking about before. But in any case, they were relatively similar, and we can show, or I can show, and I'm not going to show this, that the strength of Zionism across Europe is related to the emancipation treatment. Zionism was stronger in places that didn't have it. But of course, Jews were different too among themselves. Clearly, the example I gave about France, the Bordeaux Jews, who were merchants and traders and well-respected citizens, and the Alsatian Jews were very different. And so this poses kind of a threat to my explanation. So ideally, what we want is identical individuals that are treated some with emancipation and some without, right? And this is what I claim happens when you look or exploit the border between Congress Poland and the Pale of Settlement. I don't know how many minutes I have. 10 minutes? Or? 15. Good. All right, good. In the late 19th century, about 4 million Jews lived in the Russian Empire. This was it's a bit more than 50% of all Jews in the world. But they lived in two separate units, or they belonged to two separate political and administrative units. About 1 million lived in the territory of what was called Congress Poland, and the other 3 million lived in Imperial Russia proper. And of those, about 80% live in what was called the Pale of Settlement. Here I show the map of, I don't know if this works. Well, anyway, so you can see this is the map of Poland, interwar Poland, which is the place where I collect all the data I'm going to share with you later. And the red line is the border between Congress Poland and the Pale of Settlement before the independence of Poland. You can also see the border, the violet border is the border of Germany before 1914, and the green one is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it was all partitioned. The Congress Poland was a unit that resulted from the Duchy of Warsaw that Napoleon established in 1807, that after the Congress of Vienna was given to the Tsar. It was not changed, the borders were not changed, it was just given to the Tsar. The Pale of Settlement was the territory that went from the eastern border of Congress Poland to the border of Poland before the first partition. And that was had been under the control of Russia since the 1790s, 1770s in some areas, 1790s, all of it. And Jews, as I said, 80% of those that live in Russia proper lived in the Pale of Settlement, could not in principle move anywhere else, although many escaped, or some escaped, to Moscow and St. Petersburg and also to the Americas. These borders were set up in 1807 and 1809. They were basically the result of strategic considerations. Part of them are about rivers, and then the central segment was arbitrarily, as far as I know, defined or agreed upon by all these powers. The borders between Congress Poland and the Pale of Settlement remain in place till the end of the Russian Empire, and these two territories were administered separately, as I said before. But the rights of Jews varied over time. Till the 1860s, the Jews had no rights, basically. In fact, it seems as if the rights that they had in the Congress Poland area were even less than in the Pale of Settlement. Then, after an uprising in the 1860s, the Tsar named a new Margrave, who then gave rights or moved towards partial emancipation of the Jews in Congress Poland. So to the west, to the left of the red line, jointly with emancipation in the Austro-Hungarian part and in Germany, which I mentioned before. In the Pale of Settlement, there was also some movement towards emancipation, but after the assassination of the Tsar in 1881, there were a wave of pogroms, followed by very harsh discriminatory measures, so that by the end of the 1880s, there was this commission chaired by Count Pahlen, reporting on the differences between Jews on both sides, and the report literally says Jews in the Pale look with envy upon the Jews in the adjacent provinces of the Kingdom of Poland, who are almost entirely emancipated, though living under the jurisdiction of the same state. So, in the 1880s, one has moved towards emancipation, the other has not. And what I want to look is at what is the effect of this on the border, on those that are at around the border, right? There are, ideally, what I would like to do is to look at electoral behavior during the interwar period. There were some elections, not very clean, but the problem with, and Jewish parties were of all kinds. There were three broad families. The conservatives, who wanted to maintain the status quo, were not interested in claiming a national identity. They were just interested in getting some things like the respect for the Sabbath and things like that, perhaps some subsidies for schools, but were content with mediation in a sort of private way with the state. Then there were these socialists who wanted full emancipation, a la Marx, and then there were the Zionists, although within them they were all divided, and it was all a mess. So all stories of national liberation are a mess, I guess, from reading this. So I cannot do this through elections because they were divided, and also because many Jewish parties went to elections jointly with other national minorities. So we cannot disentangle the vote there. But I can do this through school networks. These three broad families, thank you, invested in schools. About a third of Jewish children went to Jewish schools. About 50% went to conservative Agudat Yisrael schools. 10% went to the socialist Bund schools. And then about 40% to the Zionist schools, Tarbut and Mizrahi. And here I use two measures. One is I have, with help, coded the presence of schools of each kind in towns, the miasta in Poland, about 600 observations, using the Encyclopedia of Jewish Life before and during the Holocaust, which is a very detailed account of life in all these places. I must say that this is, I think towns are good in this study because Jews were very urbanized, 70-something% of them lived in towns, and also because you have a school, you need some, there are some fixed costs, so you need to account for the cost of creating a school, and you need some small community, some community. And then I used information in Polish educational censuses in 1925, 26, and 1930-31, which are official records, so they gave me, really what was there. The problem with that is that although some schools identify themselves as Tarbut, as belonging to these networks, Tarbut and Mizrahi, explicitly others who may have been there didn't. And so there is some problem. So I'm using the two to kind of deal with the problems that each one of these measures may have. If you look at this map, this is the schools in interwar Poland, Zionist schools according to Encyclopedia. There were, as the yellow line and the green line that follows is the old border between Pale and the non-Pale area. And in the eastern part, there were twice as many towns with those schools than in the east. Perhaps you cannot see this because there are small dots that are this, without the black dots are towns with Jewish population. This is the ministry information. Here, basically, half of the schools were located in the eastern part. Sorry, not half. Half of these towns in the eastern part had these schools, according to these official records. Now, of course, the first thing that you get when you present this is, well, it may well be that the border distinguish people along other things, right? And so as much as I have tried to leverage as much information as possible to see if the border identified other things. So I have looked at geography, altitude, ruggedness of the territory, percentage of the land for crops, percentage of the land for pasture. I have looked at distance, shortest distance to railways in 1921. I have looked at total population in 1921. I have looked at Jewish population back in 1750, 1800, 1850, 1900, 1921. I look at differences in terms of proportion of Jews on both sides. I have looked at the population that declared to be Polish, of Polish nationality, as opposed to other nationalities like Russian, Ruthenian, German in the census of 1921. I have looked at the number of Catholics. I have looked through a really beautiful maps at Hasidic schools per 100,000 Jews, ethnic fractionalization and religious fractionalization, and none of them are significant. The effect of the pale effect, so the fact that being on the East is not different statistically from the West. There'll always be something. So having colleagues, I know there must be something, but I haven't found it. So here, what I show now is the data on towns. The vertical line is the border, and the horizontal line is towns, information of towns moving to the east and to the west in meters. And the vertical axis is the Zionist schools per 1,000 Jews. And the dots are the information of towns aggregated in bins of equal observations. But you change the aggregation criteria and doesn't make a difference. And what we see, I would claim, is a sharp discontinuity. The number of schools in the western part is much lower than in the eastern, at the border, where they were, the closest possible. When you look at this, we estimate this, it is a difference of, the pale effect is 0.3 schools per 1,000 Jews, and is statistically significant in the 99%. So there seems to be an effect. The story of emancipation seems to matter in the experiences of these people and the meaning they gave to what they had to do, given how they had been treated. This is for the official censuses data, the Tarbut al-Mizrahi schools. The discontinuity is very sharp. It's smaller because I have fewer observations. Now, and I'll like this, so but I'll promise I'll go quickly through this. The second identity marker is Hebrew. The percentage of Jews that claim in the census of 1931 that they spoke Hebrew as a mother tongue. We know that, at least according to the 1896 census conducted in Tsarist Russia, 97% of Jews spoke Yiddish. And those that spoke German or Polish on the other side were very few, and they were upper class Jews, basically. Hebrew was only used for religious texts and ceremonies. And according to a historian, a Stamfer, women could read a vocalized Hebrew text, but few women understood any Hebrew. And when they took a book in their hands, it was Yiddish and not in Hebrew. But with Zionism, language became a big thing, a big bone of contention. There were the Orthodox Jews that said we should keep Hebrew for what it is, which is a sacred language, and we should keep Yiddish, which is our marker. The Haskalah or pro-Enlightenment Jews said, in fact, let's substitute Yiddish for something, more serious, like German or Russian or something like that, or French or English. The Zionists claim that Hebrew, or at least some of them, claimed that it had to be the new language of the Jewish community, and they were so passionate that the others accused them of engaging on chauvinist Hebraism. Now, when the Polish authorities started the census of 1931, there was a big debate. And Zionists said, we should say, if we are Zionists, that our language is Hebrew, our mother tongue. The information is collected at the county powiat level in Poland. And the red line is the border. And the eastern part is clearly had many more people saying that they spoke Hebrew, that their mothers spoke Hebrew. Now, of course, this is at the county level, so what I do is that I try to identify these things. I have 3 minutes, and I'll promise I'll be done. A more precise identification, so what I do is I look at the schools that used the language of instruction, Hebrew, looking at the official records of the Ministry, of the Polish Ministry of Education. Of course, you have to be a bit cautious about this because there were places that, like Cheddars and traditional schools where they use Hebrew, but in principle, Hebrew was really a mark of national identity, and it was a very costly thing because a lot of them then, those that did well, had to go to high school, to gymnasium, and so investing on this thing, it was really, a big thing. And here, when you look at the discontinuity, it's also very sharp. It was very sharp, too. There was something that came with the border. So, to end. So, there is a canonical literature on national identity formation, and it emphasizes the constructed nature of nations and the advent of modernity to explain that. And I think that they are very important, and my claim is not to disregard them, on the contrary. But their explanations about the conditions that shape the nature and the distribution of modern national identities, I think should be revised in some way. First, by insisting that the modern understanding of political identity was a political construct. But it was tied to, in principle, at the beginning at least, to an emancipatory political project. It was the idea of a construction of political community of equals that by self-determining themselves acquire this national identity. Remember that Weber was a liberal. He was very nationalist. Of course, we look at this now after what happened in Europe in the 1930s and 40s, but that was not the way it was thought about, right? And it was not the way it was thought about by anti-colonial movements either. Now, so basically, whether this project, this blueprint, succeeded or not was fundamental. When it did, there was a unified idea. But when it didn't, then this led to a multiplicity of competing national projects. When you explore those places that are not complete, they are not uncontested, where the identity is not uncontested, what you find is a weak liberal nation-state project, weak because they were not able to impose it. Then you have a reactionary, essentialist nationalist discourse that is constructed by, in fact, conservative actors that oppose this, or at least opposed in the past this change, this new project, and then an emancipatory project with lots of twists, of course, of those that were unhappy with the treatment or the non-treatment and developed a new sense of nation. And so here, basically, what I have done is I have taken you to an exploration of this using information about how Jews responded to the treatments they received. I think that this, in a way, can be used to think about other cases, African Americans, the colonial movement, and many other possibilities starting from this project. So I'll stop here and thank you so much for your patience.